Uh, Good evening. Welcome to the Marion Minor Athenaeum, Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. I'm a Vasquez, and for the last time, I've been one of your fellows for this year. In January, those of us in California who had been hoping for relief after yet another dry spell, part of a larger mega drought, the worst in over 1,200 years, were met with a 3-week extreme storm. With it, the storm brought flooding that left billions of dollars in damages and over 20 people dead. And despite all this loss, storms like this are only a mild relief to the 22-year drought that the state has been facing. While cycles of rainfall and drought are supposed to be normal in California, climate change has taken these weather events to the extremes. Since then, we've continued to have some interesting weather, to say the least. I mean, it was snowing here back in March. Well, technically it was grapple, but still, the sliding scale between drought and flooding doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of water problems in the western United States. As there's also the pressing issues of groundwater depletion, aging infrastructure, environmental pollution, equity and access, tribal water rights, the list goes on and on. Being responsible for these interstate issues seems pretty Herculean, even Sisyphean at times. So what have people been doing? And more importantly, what else can we do? Joining us tonight is an expert who has dedicated herself to water policy management, Felicia Marcus, the current William C. Landreth Visiting Fellow at Stanford University's Water in the West program. Also working as an attorney, consultant, and member of the Water Policy Group, Marcus has had a distinguished career in water management. She has served as the chair of the California State Water Board during the state's worst drought in modern history, where she had regulatory oversight over water conservation, groundwater management, wastewater recycling, water rights laws, and the list goes on and on. She has also held leadership positions with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, heading the Southwestern Pacific region and working on air, water, and toxic issues, as well as leading the Los Angeles Department of Public Works, where she received national awards for environmental policies. Ms. Marcus has also been involved with national nonprofit organizations and has been recognized for her expertise with appointments, such as serving on the Commission on Environmental Cooperation Joint Public Advisory Council for the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, and being elected as a fellow in the U.S. National Academy of Public Administration. Tonight, Ms. Marcus will discuss the pressing issues and challenges of water issues and policy in the Western United States. Before welcoming our speaker, we kindly ask that video and audio recordings are put away. Video and audio recording devices are put away, and kindly remind the audience that strictly prohibited. At the end of tonight's presentation, there will be some time for Q&A. Ms. Marcus's Athenaeum presentation is part of the Climate Solution Series this spring and will be moderated by visiting professor Tom McKenna. With that in mind, please welcome to the AF, Felicia Marcus.
Well, good evening, everyone. And I'm just so happy to see you here and have this opportunity. Felicia is an old and dear friend. We were classmates in law school and actually in the same study group because McHenry and Marcus are close to each other in the alphabet, and our two other study group members were McAlilly and Murphy. So the M's were together. I thought we'd make a nice Irish law firm or something. Anyway. We're going to have a wide-ranging discussion, and hopefully we'll have some nice Q&A. We usually go for about half an hour, 40 minutes with the planned Q&A, and then open it up to the audience. Felicia, I'll refer to her, Ms. Marcus. Felicia, I know her by her first name, has a really extraordinary background for those of you interested in environmental law and policy and implementation, because she is one of the few people with a strong environmental background who's actually served in regional government, in city government, regional government with the EPA, state government, and the federal government as well. So the breadth of her expertise is really extraordinary. She's also, as you will hear from her comments, a student of public administration. She's genuinely interested in how we can govern better, how we can clean up the environment, how we can address the pressing issues that climate change are forcing upon us. And those are particularly stark ones here in California. When I invited her to come speak, I thought she would be talking about, and I was asking her about the drought. And now, tonight, I can ask her about the drought and the potential flood. So we'll have both those things to talk about. So you want to hear from her, not from me. And I'm going to start with higher education because I think that's a great place to start. Schools like CMC and the other Claremont colleges play an incredibly important role in our society. And she's attended some very prestigious schools. She teaches as one right now that just received a 1.6 billion, that's billion with a B, dollar gift from John Doerr to establish a new school at Stanford in sustainability. And Felicia, what do you see as the role and promise of American higher education? Where is it failing, and maybe where is it succeeding? And then we'll get to teaching sustainability.
Whoa, that's big. Well, first of all, thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to everybody else who had a hand in inviting me. I always enjoy coming here, and I'm honored to get a chance to spend some time with you tonight, and looking forward not only to Tom's questions, but to the questions that you may have. And again, I should start with a caveat that I'm not a PhD, I'm not a faculty member. I am in a visiting fellowship that's designed to bring a practitioner into the academy. So occasionally it's an academic from another institution. More often it's a policymaker who's left a job like the one I had and gets really usually 3 months full-time or 6 months half-time, and in part due to the pandemic, and in part due to some foundations funding, and in part due to this imminent or this coming sustainability school looming. That was the word. Thank you, Tom. Sustainability school. I will be here for 3 years at present, and hopefully longer. So I'm kind of a walking experiment who hopefully won't kill the program. But it's been interesting because I've spent more time sort of, again, as an outsider in the academy, putting on my Margaret Mead anthropologist hat to try and figure out the creature, with way more time than the fellowship normally gives someone, where they're supposed to detox from an intense event, maybe teach a class, maybe write a paper, lecture in a few classes, advise students and others, and then go on about their way. And so I've had a lot more time. So I may have more observations than I'm entitled to. So let me just say, though, it's of a policymaker rather than an academic looking at this institution. But I will say that both at NRDC and at the Trust for Public Land, I was the point person for dealing with academic institutions, particularly the environmental ones, Nicholas Bren, Yale Forestry School, etc., doing lectures, but also being a bridge. So it's not just Stanford. I think the critical role, and this is my view, of the academy is to be a creative place for thinking about new ideas, grounded not just in fancy, but grounded in history and experience. Not grounded in history, experience to repeat what's gone before, but grounded in history and experience to try and advance thinking about issues, whether it's in science, poli-sci. I tend to be a governance geek, as Tom said, and if I stay permanently at Stanford, clearly there are a whole range of governance issues that I want to be writing about, and strategic regulation and things like that. What I found is a mix when you say how it's going, and I could say more on what's going well, and that I see it's helping to not just educate and train the next generation, but to, again, enable the next generation to think more creatively than the ones who have come before. And that's not to say that people don't stay creative through their lives. I mean, some of the people I've met at Stanford, as well as other fields, are people who are constantly learning, constantly hungry to know more, rather than resting on their laurels. I have also known academics, both through being a student and now being involved, where people feel like they've written their opus, and they teach everybody that same opus as if it is a rule rather than a tool. I've seen people who look at models they've developed as if it's going to spit out the answer, when models are a tool to illuminate and think, not a rule or formula for what is really going to happen out in the world. Same is true when you're going through, if you're in policy classes or environmental policy and you're looking at environmental impact reports. They're not there to point the way to the promised land and the right roadmap. They're there to illuminate the alternatives and the options and the pros and cons so that reasonable decision makers and the public can make a reasonable decision. Not a perfect one. Politicians get slammed for being wrong. In hindsight, nobody's right all the time, but you want to educate and illuminate in the public sector. And that kind of inquiry and teaching is something that I think higher education institutions have, I think, a responsibility and obligation to encourage and help flourish. And as you know, there are different institutions, but also just different teachers. Every person's different. Some teaching the rule or this is the way. I love the Mandalorian, but this is the way. It's not the way to teach anybody something. And I think that there's an obligation to help elevate the discourse in society. The other thing I think that higher education has an important role in doing that I don't see happening everywhere all the time, some places are better at than others, some teachers are better at it than others, is this integration, and we may be getting to this again, between policy and science. And it's something that I understand you all are looking at in this whole new science program, which has me very excited. And that is that you have the sciences going down a very specific track, and it's hard to be a scientist, really hard to get there, and a peculiar language that people within that sector understand. And there are norms for how one presents papers, for example, in getting your PhD dissertation or in a forum of your other experts, that is not the way you should be communicating to policymakers. Because policymakers, their eyes will cross, they'll get impatient, legislators will become rude. Usually other policymakers do not. There's a little, I'm now spitballing here. There's a difference. And I think there's a need to also teach how to communicate to other sectors, because you want to have your science make a difference. You don't want it to be shooting from the lip by any means. You want the rigor of science, but there's some crosswalk. I think that there should be classes in, just as we were discussing earlier in the day, there should be training for policymakers on the basics of science. And I don't know, when Tom and I went to school in the 70s, I certainly was true in my high school. You went to a better high school. But in college, I think we were too flexible on what people had to study, and you could talk your way out of any requirement. I feel like I didn't learn what I should have come out of college learning, and I had to catch up on it on my own afterwards. So I just think there's some basics, but that crosswalk between science and the science and the policy or the humanities silos should actually be more integrated. Because then I think we'll generate more well-rounded citizens, but maybe even more people who will play an effective role in the policymaking world, because we need all the help we can get given the freight train of pain that's coming at us all. And that's, I'm just talking about environmental issues. There are freight trains of pain all around the social sciences and sciences, et cetera. So.
And I think part of what you're referring to is us ducking all the science classes or taking the easy ones and looking back on that and saying that was a mistake.
Yeah, exactly.
Stanford got this huge gift, $1.6 billion to found a school of sustainability. I know that it's still in the formative stage. What can you tell us about what Stanford is thinking about how to teach sustainability that might inform us here at the Claremont colleges about how we teach people about science and the environment?
Well, I don't want to be presumptive that
No,
Stanford
be presumptive.
has...
They want mine, yeah.
No, I'm sure people back home, this isn't recorded, right? They want me to be presumptive, but I don't know enough. I will say, what I can say is what, from trying to follow what's going on and being in certain rooms at all, the theory of the sustainability school is a desire to accelerate the kind of change that I barely just touched. That we've got people in the energy field, in the water field, in the biology field. We've got all kinds of little nodes of people doing really wonderful things and very impressed with their own wonderfulness and Stanfordness, whatever each institution always does that, when there are just a zillion great institutions out there, but trying to make the whole greater than the sum of the parts. That somehow by bringing everybody under the same umbrella, you will have more cross-silo conversations and projects, And it's infused with like anybody who does a plan. I always think there's too much of these, or maybe I'm just getting old and tired of strategic plans. You've got pillars and you've got cross cutting, and there's always a matrix with a pretty design. Maybe you guys aren't bored with these yet, but I'm like 50 years ahead of you practically. And you don't know if it really means anything. So the pieces of this that seem important to me are acknowledging that a matrix across issues, that if we're going to reach, climate's not in the name, but climate is clearly sort of the brass ring or the freight train of pain or whatever metaphor you like coming at us, where we need to figure out how not to just be in our own little silos, but how to get people who can work across disciplines to do all the things we need to do across the disciplines, whether it's water or energy or natural resource management or you name it, in order to deal with this very cross-media challenge, and very cross-media challenge in terms of adaptation, but clearly also in terms of mitigation, where it's not just getting rid of coal, it's not just fossil fuels, it's what do you do with them? How do we keep the lights on? How do we make things work? How do we deal with our natural lands? How do we manage everything in a way that doesn't make the future hellish, frankly? And that requires everybody to up their game. And so you have the matrix with all the topic areas, but you also have a real emphasis on a policy accelerator. And it's not fully baked yet. This is part of the reason I'm there, because they do want to have more policymakers and people with policy experience so that the science and research they do is more likely to matter. Not to become political as an academic, but to figure out how to communicate, what to study that's actually going to be useful, how to find those synergies, say, between water and energy and food, or you could pick any other number of things that are all interrelated in life, not necessarily interrelated in the silos of our excellence that we get to in academia or even in agencies, but in life. People have needs in their day across transportation and housing and food and all. That's the way regular people think about the world, and they're all interrelated and touch each other. And yet in both our academic and our policymaking silos, we have a tendency to specialize so much that we miss very common connections. And so there's a development, not developed yet, but a very important part of it, which is to have some kind of a policy accelerator, much as Stanford. Again, you know, as with people, you do what you think you're good at. Stanford has done very well with taking technology and accelerating it into production and into the field of commerce, whether through Silicon Valley or the medical school or medical profession. So they kind of want to do the same thing, figuring out how to speed whatever research and innovations and other things that they do. But so at first it's how do you integrate across these departments into what feels like a more holistic school, where that magic of the synergies with people from other disciplines that you wouldn't know otherwise is going to yield something better than you would have alone. And the other is how do you accelerate it, in this case not to market, but into useful policy world.
Well, we're going to be watching carefully because this will be very interesting. And by the way, that conversation suggests some of the same thinking that's going on to the Integrated Science Center, the Robert Day Integrated Science Center is going to be at the other end of your campus, with one of the three foci, as I understanding, being planetary solutions, which is climate and the environment. While we're on that, and before we go to water, which is and climate generally, which most of what we'll talk about, and this will be a bit of a repeat of what you talked about in the climate solution class earlier today, is a lot of the students in this room are interested in government. They study government. It's a major part of the curriculum here at CMC, but also at the other Claremont colleges. Your career has included posts number of different governmental agencies. What would you suggest to undergraduate students interested in a similar career path, that care about the environment, care about government, want to be involved in government?
Well, that's good. First of all, wanting to be involved in government and as a stint is a good thing, because we need more people in government who want to make a difference in the world. I think it's a great place to go. It's a great place to go, but not shelve yourself at in some job that doesn't feed your soul or your brain or whatever, just to be in it. And you have to use your volition. And the most successful people I've seen have moved around within state, local, or federal government to have different experiences. And sometimes they find the space where they singly are making a contribution to the world that they feel good about, other people feel good about. Sometimes it's being the chief expert on drinking water treatment in the country or in the state or whatever, and other times it's someone who's really good at making things happen in whatever the newest program is. It's a mix of what your passion is, what grabs your head, and what you find through your, and this is going to get to the recommendation, what you find through your career you seem to be good at, which is something I think is an obligation of, I would say, friends, family, teachers, etc., is not just to correct people on places they can improve, but to tell them what they're good at. Because not everybody knows. Some people think they're good at things they're not good at. We all know that. But there are an awful lot of people in the world who actually don't know what they're good at. They don't see what they seem better at, or it's easier for them to see than other people. Some people who see things faster, something seems easier to them. Now I'm lecturing again, sorry, pontificating, that it's because they're better than everybody else or other people are stupid or lazy. No, we're all wired differently. Some of us are better at seeing certain things than others, and it kind of takes a village, but it really takes professors and mentors and others in jobs who are willing to tell you what you're good at. You have to ask sometimes, but a lot of times you don't, and you need to figure that out, because there is the idea of a job. And I could tell stories where there was an idea, I was telling one earlier today, of what I thought I wanted to do because I liked the idea of it. But if you really thought about it for a minute, the details of that job didn't suit my personality. And ultimately, over time, particularly since I did a lot of internships, a lot of volunteer work, a lot of, moving around through these different jobs, most of which weren't my idea, largely because I was lucky enough to have someone say, you ought to do this. And I'd always say, no, I can't do that. And they say, yeah, you can do that. You would be good at that. I go, I wouldn't be good at that. No, you would be good at that. And I actually was better at those things than the things I thought I wanted to do. So you kind of do have to create or leave an opening in the world. Sometimes you have to ask, and sometimes you can be lucky, for thinking about the idea of the thing, the stuff that's involved in the thing, what's the cadence of it, what are the facts you're going to learn? What are the people you're going to be around? And then figuring out how to get to know yourself and what you seem to, if you do the thing that's easier for you to do and that you seem to do quicker than others and everybody else does that, then we all elevate kind of our game. So I think that's important.
Before we go to climate and water, what's the number one skill that's most important to learn during your education, which may include undergraduate and graduate education, to be effective, to work on the environment, climate, and other issues?
Well, I didn't just say this earlier today. I'll say this on street corners if anybody gives me a chance. It's people skills. It's not being the smartest. Nobody likes the smartest guy in the room. I hate to say it. Does anybody like the smartest guy in the room? Nobody does. And anybody who walks into the room thinking they're the smartest guy in any room clearly isn't, because everybody's different skills at different things. There's not one kind of intelligence. There's not, it's like in that, I was talking earlier today about this speech I give as a manager, because people who think they're really smart won't listen to advice very well unless this is my tip for the day, I do a speech on the 10 dysfunctions of smart people. Because if they're smart, they want to know what the dysfunctions that come with that title, and then they'll listen. And one of the things that's really important is to know that there are different kinds of intelligence, and it takes all kinds of intelligence. It's not just emotional intelligence and speed intelligence. There's all kinds of intelligence. And sometimes you will see people, and you probably can think of them as I say this, it's like they've mastered level 3 on a video game, and they think there are only 3 levels. If you're really smart, there are probably people that are smarter than you, and you want there to be smarter people than you, and you don't know what those levels are everywhere. So having an awareness of that is really important, and that ties in to people skills. The people skills, how you relate to the people around you, how you relate to the people in different stakeholder groups, how you relate to people in government, business, environmental justice, tribes, you name it, wherever you are really listening to people, learning what you can, learning how to try and understand them, even if they don't speak the same language as you, and I mean English to English, and really being inquisitive that way is the most useful skill you can have, particularly since in the environmental world and in dealing with climate, we've got to work across all these different silos of practice and language and personality type. And as I said earlier today, I don't care what you do to teach yourself. There are classes. It should almost be mandatory. It can be Covey's 7 Habits. It can be all the Mars and Venus books. And I hated that guy, but those books are helpful about more than relationships. It can be anyone, any of those books, or it can be just being astute about these things, learning your Myers-Briggs type. What color are you, what kind of animal in you.com doesn't really help that much, but it's fun to do as a party game. No matter what I do, I'm a dog. I'm some kind of a dog. And that has helped me in my career because I'm friendly and a pack animal. But with prairie dog, wild dog, domestic dog, I was trying to be a penguin. I'm not a penguin. But I mean, it's just fun. Animalinyou.com. It's fun to do. But all those things that help illuminate the fact that we're wired differently, and you have to actually work at understanding each other and crosswalk. You have to want to understand what other people bring. If you do that, you will be more useful in any room. And if you won't do that, you're a pain in the butt and you're going to hold us back. And the environmental world is filled with those, I have to say. And it's true in other activist groups where people get their sense of righteousness or justification through being better than someone else. And I say a pox on anybody who needs to do that to feel good about themselves. You have to work at feeling good about yourself and feeling good about as many people as you possibly can. And I am not saying there aren't jerks out there in the world. There are plenty of them. But there are far fewer of them than appear at first blush. And I will tell you that if you try to understand them, you can reach agreements, you can cross divides. You might use a different word than you might have used, and all of a sudden people understand what you're talking about. But if you try to be a bridge builder and really understand people and respect them and try to understand, you will get further in your career than you can ever imagine. If you don't do it, you may not understand why you're not moving further in your career.
Thank you. You remind me of the quote, which goes something like, if you're talking, you're not learning, right? You'd be listening. Let's switch and talk about climate and then about water. Your talk tonight is the last in a series on climate solutions that's been sponsored, by the way, by the Roberts Environmental Center here at CMC. And we've had Mary Nichols, who chaired the Resources Board, Tom Steyer, who ran for president, largely on a climate platform. And we're thrilled that you're batting cleanup for us today. Can you start with a kind of 30,000-foot view? Where are we on climate? Not just water, but where are we on climate generally? Making progress, and what do we need to do?
Well, I have to start with a disclaimer. I'm a glass half full person. I have to say it's a better way to live, and there's all kinds of studies that show that optimists actually get more done than pessimists. I'm not saying I'm a Pollyanna, because I think we were talking about this in another context. I'm actually fairly cynical, and I don't expect a lot from people, so I'm less disappointed than most people walk around being all the time. I'm just grateful for people who try to do things for other people and are good, and I'm not always kind of judging, but I think it's a better way to live. So I say this as a caveat because I don't want to seem like a Pollyanna, but again, no, my expectations are low. So the fact that we're at the very beginning, I think, of finally getting to a consciousness, not across the whole population, but across the sort of dominant dialogue at the national and international level about climate, that, oh yes, climate change is real and anthropogenic, even though this is one of those communications. The facts have been there for decades. The scientists have been there in great numbers for decades, but it did not punch through. And it didn't punch through, this is my bias in terms of language. Who gives a hoot about 350 parts per million in the atmosphere? Who knows what that means? Who knows what 2 degrees Celsius means?
We have one physics major I know might be able to help
people
us.
Who know. You're not going to grab the public, and yet being a part of it, NRC, we hammered it because we knew that, and that to scare the crap out of us. That's where Inconvenient Truth and the way Al Gore did his chart, that was much more effective communication, and you saw the impact that had. But we also followed it up with numbers that were meaningless, good guys, bad guys, time honored, gets headlines, but doesn't really move faster. And we made a big, this is a hobby horse of mine, since you gave me this microphone. We also made, I think, a big mistake in the environmental. I'll own it, even though I didn't design it. I thought it was weird, but I didn't fight it at the time, which was to not talk about adaptation. Now, truth be told, that's what I've been spending my time on the last 4 years because I care about it. That even though adaptation, I think, from a communication standpoint, makes the case for mitigation, like being able to articulate what's going to happen under climate change and what we need to do, all the expense, but also all the work we need to do to deal with, oh yeah, we'll talk water, the bleeding edge of climate change, droughts, floods, sea level rise, and more. That's what makes the case for mitigation, not an abstract number of parts per million in the atmosphere that billions of people collectively emit. So I think we made it, we wasted a lot of time on that political judgment. People thought adaptation was capitulation and that it was so important to forestall what we're already in that we didn't think would be here this soon. Was really important, but the fact of the matter is we've wasted a bunch of time and there are millions of people who will be hurt and die because we didn't do a better job of getting to this day faster. I really don't sound like a glass half full person, do I? But I am. But the good news is here we are. And here we are where people in both parties, mostly, a little different, let's say people in both parties below the daily is so is not, you're a jerk, no I'm not level of discourse that we have so much of today, but there's a recognition we have to do something, and a lot of the arguments are what? That's good. That's better than not. We have a shot at mitigating the impacts that our kids and grandkids are gonna, it's gonna be a very different world. Maybe it was naive to think we could stop it, but I think it's pretty amazing the level that we have it at. I've gone to a bunch of the COPs. I haven't gone to all 27 of them, but I've gone to 5, I think, of them. And the fact that the whole world comes together every year to even talk about this is pretty incredible if you think about it. And that we've thought about it productively in some of these meetings. Not, again, it's always after these COPs, the view is some progress made, could have been worse, not as fast as it needs to be, but some encouraging signs and the things that are left to the next year because they just can't get to it. It's still fairly impressive. So we're potentially on the beginning of the path, and I've been encouraged in part because of work at the UN, but also the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, in particular, as we talked about earlier today, the fact that land-based emissions have made it into the discourse, so that it's not, we could stop emitting fossil fuels now, and we still won't make it, because there are so many emissions coming from things like deforestation, land disturbance, and particularly catastrophic wildfires that have come from the fact that Smokey Bear was a little too successful in some cases, and also the nature of how we turned our forests into tree plantations, much denser than a natural forest, and making them much more vulnerable to these outsized catastrophic wildfires that are now emitting more carbon than fossil fuels. Well, that has, at the international level, I was going to say lit a fire under, and it motivated people to focus on this area and forest management in a way that we haven't seen, and in a way in which at the national level we've got billions of dollars going into it, even just at the state level, billions of dollars from cap and trade and other funding. And so I'm seeing motion. In California in particular, and this is why I was asked to do the paper because I was in California, you know, we have a sort of a going along on nature-based solutions, at least in reports so far. The Climate Smart California Plan is actually a very good document with very good recommendations, which if followed through on, will put California in the lead. We probably already are in the lead, although Oregon and some other states have done some good things towards trying to figure out how do we manage the natural world in a more productive way for multi-benefits, but also for carbon sequestration and avoided carbon emissions. And so I'll use one more example that Mary may or may not have gotten to when you had, Mary's one of my mentors, so it's just so much fun, you know, now one of my best friends, but she's someone who went to lunch with me when she didn't know me from Adam because someone asked her to advise me, and she's sort of one of the key experience of mine. She's amazing. There is nobody like her in the world, and that's recognized all over the world, which is kind of cool. But we have this potential in California in the scoping plan to go long on this. So if you read the scoping plan, which is kind of easy to read, oddly, some of you may have read it, they have made a conscious decision to say, because of the future emissions that will come from these catastrophic wildfires, which we haven't been counting, right? Because historically we thought trees grow, trees burn, they grow back, it's a wash, it's hard to measure. We're going to focus on these industrial emissions we can measure and a few other things, of course. It's a wash, and that we know it's not a wash anymore. They are going on long on the dealing with managing the forest to take out some of these fuel ladders and some of this overgrowth, including using prescribed and cultural burns, all kinds of things, knowing that it's going to emit more carbon in the short run because we're going to take out that sequestration of that woody and other debris to avoid these much bigger plumes later. That's a degree of understanding on the part of ARB in their rulemaking that I had not seen before. I don't mean to disparage, but we're at this kind of evolutionary place of figuring out, again, going back to what I was talking about people skills, how to integrate across the silos. And that's what we need to do. And we need a lot of science to do it. We're going to need a lot of quantification to help. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it's got to be enough to help a policymaker make that kind of a decision, that's going to make a difference for the future and be able to defend it in the court of public opinion. So I'm encouraged by the movement, just as I'm completely freaked out and dismayed and heartbroken about what we're leaving our kids and our grandkids, and having conversations with my grandson about it. My husband and I, you know, we don't apologize every time, but I feel really bad at what we're leaving them. And the only thing that makes me feel okay about it is know we've spent our whole careers trying to make it better. And if we hadn't been around, it would have been a whole lot worse. But that's cold comfort when you think about what's to come.
And I bet some of those feelings are shared by some of the young people who are here in our audience. Just a couple of quick qualifiers. COP is Conference of the Parties, for those who don't know, which is the UN organized conference on climate, which takes place every year. And the next one coming up is going to be in Dubai. The other is ARB, is the Air Resources Board. The scoping plan is the plan that the California Air Resources Board has written, which was, I believe, adopted in December of 2022. So just a few months ago, an extraordinary document if you're interested in climate issues in terms of charting a course for the future of California. Terrific reading. Many of the students in this room came, especially if you're a freshman, to the Claremont colleges. Last fall, we were in the 7th year of a drought, wondering if there'd be enough water, wondering if the hills were going to burn up. And their parents are now calling them and saying, are you going to be flooded out of your dorm? Are we in a flood? Are we in a drought? Are we in both? Help us understand where we are in terms of water in California. And then we'll get Colorado River questions probably from the audience in a moment.
Well, it depends on the timing. I mean, I've had this conversation a lot in the media and elsewhere, and why it took so long to call off the drought in some places, and it's a mix. My answer to almost every question about these things, and this is my answer to a lot of things, because it's true, is it depends. And it depends on where you are, right? So, and it depends on what you're looking at. So we have been in a long drought. I appreciate you called it a 7-year drought. So a 7-year drought punctuated by 2016-17 rains. A lot of people, I always refer to it as 2 different droughts. I don't know why. It's sort of my drought when I was there and it was in my face all the time and I had to be drought girl. And then this drought where I haven't been in that job dealing with it 24/7, but thinking about it and talking about it. But again, you don't know until in hindsight. Any dry year can be the first year of a 10, 20, 30-year drought. We just don't know because let me give you some context. I mean, I could give the short answer, but I could give some context. Is that all right?
Please.
All right. So for the last 100 or so years, 120 years or so, we've been keeping records in California. We've had a more or less 3 to 4 year drought cycle. The geophysical record, this is where scientists are important, and scientists being able to communicate in the court of public opinion and to policymakers is even more important. The geophysical record shows we have 40 and 400 year droughts in California. That's not news. Everybody knows, but all of our policymaking has been around the 3 to 4 year drought. All of our infrastructure has been built around the 3 to 4 year drought. But the science has always been there that it could be longer. Now, you can't build for a 40-year or 400-year drought. That would be prohibitively expensive and difficult to do. But you could be a little more mindful, as opposed to when you see the headlines every time we get towards a second or third dry year. It's like, oh my God, the sky is falling. It's like, no, this is perfectly acceptable. Australia had the same, more or less the same 120-year records with a more or less 3 to 4 year drought cycle. And then in the mid-90s, they hit a drought. And the first year came, second year came, third year came, then the fourth year came. They thought, well, surely, it's like you're like in Las Vegas or something. Well, surely we'll roll at 7 this time. And they thought, and they ended up going 6 years in a drought. And we're not prepared for it at all because they kept thinking it would get better. Then they had a little bit of rain, and they thought, phew. And then they had 3 of the worst years yet. So, and that was very important, and that influenced how we reacted to the drought in the mid-teens, and why we went faster and more dramatically to do mandatory urban water conservation regulations, which were not popular and were disruptive to local water agencies. And it was because the governor made a choice that he would rather disrupt the local water agencies and have them mad at him if it started raining after 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, than to have the entire state of California and his historic legacy furious that we were in a 10-year drought and he had let people hemorrhage their precious water they needed for health and sanitation on how green their lawn was in the middle of a drought. So we're going to have that. We're going to have those longer droughts. All of the climate predictions are that we're going to have more frequent and drier dries. Now, we're lucky compared to a place like South Africa. They're just going to get drier. Ours is going to be punctuated by what Daniel Swain calls weather whiplash. And if you don't follow Daniel Swain on Twitter, and he may be moving to Mastodon, I just saw, I don't know, but he's got a Weather West. He's got his whole YouTube he puts out almost every, is it YouTube that he puts it on? You can get to him, Daniel Swain. He's amazing. He's a young man affiliated with, he's at UCLA and one of the labs and TNC. He's just got a knack, and he coined weather whiplash and a bunch of other phrases. We just have to get ready for that. And the advantage of that is we're going to get winters like this with 30 atmospheric rivers and a 300% snowpack in the southern Sierras, 100 and something, I think, in the northern Sierras, and we're going to have massive flooding. And it's going to be worse in some ways because with a few degrees temperature rise Fahrenheit, more precipitation we do get is going to fall as rain rather than snow. So we are going to have more flooding in the spring and less snowpack later in the year. And the snowpack is essential to modern California working because it is our largest storage reservoir, where it preserves the precipitation up there, it melts out slowly during the spring and the summer, refills those reservoirs. They're not one and done. They get refilled as the snow melts and as we use it, and it replenishes our streams, and it restores our groundwater basins at a pace that can be absorbed, unless you get massive flooding, which is all about heat waves. And oh yeah, is it going to get hotter? Yeah. So we are about to ride a pretty scary roller coaster with an advantage of that we're going to have the scary wet roller coasters that we can capture some of. And we've got to make up for those. The snowpack we're going to lose by getting it into the ground faster. That's why we have the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act now, and you have groundwater agencies all over the Central Valley in particular working on figuring out how to get water into the ground faster because it doesn't naturally percolate as fast as you can fill a reservoir. But our groundwater basins are the only thing that can compensate in size for that snowpack. So where are we? We have to prepare for drought and flood every year. That was in our water action plan back in 2012 or 13, because that's where our future was. And we've got to do things like set back floodplains so that you can dissipate the force of flooding across the land rather than bursting levees or carving new straight channels, or sticking them in straight channels so you can get more of that water out onto the land, into the groundwater basin. It has environmental benefits for wildlife. There's a win-win-win there, but we've got to put a lot of money into it. We're going to have to move people out of it. So, I mean, that's where we are. And so for a politician, and I thought Governor Newsom did a good job of navigating this, you don't want to declare the drought over everywhere if some areas are still in drought, and some are. But more importantly, what a drought declaration gives you, which is not a scientific judgment, it is a political judgment. There are certain tools you get in a state of emergency where the governor can do things like anti-gouging orders and executive orders, waiving CEQA, so that you can do some environmentally beneficial or other things faster than you could otherwise. You don't want to abuse it, but you need to use it to protect fish and wildlife and people. And you need it in some cases for the kind of contracting you need to do to get emergency water to small communities whose wells have run dry, not just because of the drought, but because their neighbors have moved in and put in deeper wells, which has exacerbated the impact of the drought. And so when Governor Brown withdrew the drought declaration, he did it very much the same way, which is he declared it over in most of the state, but not in the counties where we still needed to be delivering water to people in buckets and on trucks and in bins, or we needed to be able to drill wells for them or run pipes as emergencies. So again, a complicated mess of things. The other thing I'll say that's hard to tell when you're reading the paper, and it's weird because I'm on this University of Nebraska board and I need to ask them to let me go over to talk to those drought monitor guys there, is the media likes using those maps that are the yellow, brown, red, orange, the colors that show what areas of the state are in drought. Well, in California, the weather in the place does not tell you what their water situation is at all. Why? Because in California, over half the population lives hundreds of miles from their water course. It's all tied together. That's why it's a system of storage and conveyance that gets water to LA from both the Colorado and the Sierras, two different ways, from the eastern and western Sierras, and groundwater basins. And so some people have very flush groundwater basins. This area is among the best managers of groundwater. 90% of what runs off the mountains goes into this groundwater basin. It's also why it's a Superfund site, because everything that got put on the ground also made a beeline through the ground. But that's why you have so many of these recharge basins. But they do a really good job of it, and the challenge is figuring out how to pump, treat, serve. I mean, it's just fascinating and very, very well managed, but we don't have that everywhere, and we're going to need to have that in more places.
I want to get to questions from the students in just a second, Felicia, but I want to give you a chance to briefly, now that everybody knows what to say to their parents when you get home from graduation or the end of the year, whether you're in a drought or in a flood, you can now explain both. I want a little bit of an overview of the Colorado River and the challenges associated with that, and then I want students who have questions to stand up behind the microphones. I'm not sure whether we usually move the microphones out here. Middle, go ahead and bring them out. People could start lining up and just give everybody a little overview. What are the things you need to know about the fight over the Colorado River?
Well, let me do what I can do. I just did a panel on this at Aurora West Conference. It was really actually fun. I had folks from different states and tribes talking about it. It's what you need to know about the fight, but a little bit what you need to know as you read the paper over the course of the next 6 months, because the paper, they try well. There's some very nice reporters. It's so complicated, they don't always get it right. So what we have in the Colorado is we have this amazing different geology, different geography, where you've got a huge river going through 7 states, 2 countries, 10 or 13 tribes, depending on how you count it, and there's a big fight over that within the tribes. And you have a geology where you have you could build the 2 largest reservoirs in the country. Those reservoirs have cushioned for Arizona, Nevada, and California the impact of a 23-year drought on the Colorado River. The upper basin states don't have as much storage. Again, geography, geology, some of it's money, but it's geography and geology, a lot of it. And when they have a drought, they have more lands that are fallowed. In the other states, they've been bailed out by these giant bathtubs that have now gone down at a frightening level, where the hydropower that those two projects support are threatened with not being able to operate, which is a problem for people who rely on that energy, but it's also a problem for the infrastructure itself. Some of the pumps that have been in water for a long time and then aren't, there's a problem there, and there, I'm sure, engineers in the room who can explain that. But I know it to be true. And you're also at risk of getting to dead pool. And so we've had the 7 states kind of watch it go down, and they haven't been fiddling while Rome burned. They've come to 3, 4, 5 agreements on how to keep those levels up to forestall this agreed upon series of tough cuts, but they finally reached the end of that string. And so the federal government, who is the manager of the river, had to take the unprecedented step of saying last year, you guys have got to come to a real significant agreement. We can't afford to let the facility be hurt. You can't afford to not have energy. You can't afford to get to dead pool. You've got to take bigger cuts sooner, and we want 25% cuts, which is really big when you think about the farms and urban areas and others dependent upon it. And they actually weren't able, they reached the end of their string on being able to agree. And so the federal government, this is, I won't get into all, we can get into questions if you want, has done a series of things and been critiqued for being too tough or not tough enough along the way to say, you guys have to come to agreement or we're going to make a unilateral decision that is going to be different than the agreements we have on the river, because those agreements will get us to dead pool rather than to forestalling the dramatic economic and cultural and you name it shock of just having the taps go dry somewhere, a really radical rationing. And so generally we've had, I can get into the law, but I'll try not to. Where we are right now, I'll jump to where we are, is we're a couple of months since there were a flurry of headlines dealing with the fight between the states, where you had the 6 states above California come up with what they called a consensus agreement, which is interesting when it's 6 of 7. It's easy for the 6 to come up with it because they put the major bulk of the cuts on California, and then they cast California as a holdout, like California were being bad. Well, California actually has the law and the agreements on their side, and so California turned around and went, nice try, but we're going to put in a constructive alternative that honors what the law is on the river, their senior water rights, but we'll still give up some. And why don't we just try and use the template we've used for other agreements to get us through the next few years, because in 2026 we have to come up with an entirely new agreement, and that's going to be very difficult. But they were kind of in their battle stations, if you use much harsher rhetoric and poking at each other than we'd seen. Flash forward to but this week or last week? Last week.
Yeah, last week.
Last week. The federal government came out with just an environmental impact statement that has 3 options in it. One is do nothing, which is not a useful option because then you get to the dead pool and those impacts. But they studied those impacts so you can see those impacts. The other is follow water rights to the max. That's harsher than what California asked for. This is what would happen if you just followed water rights, which means
When
California.
you say water rights, you mean the law.
The law of the
water.
river. Well, water rights, they're kind of different in each state, but there's water rights where seniority is first in time, first in right. You get all of your share before the next guy gets a drop. It's very harsh. That's true throughout the West. It's not equitably divided. There are certain different states have different rules where they can adjust it. California has more of them than others, where we can take water for the environment, or we can call something waste and unreasonable use and say, even if you're senior, that's unreasonable. And we've used that a fair amount in the past. Still hard to do, difficult. This is the other paper I'm late on. You're getting a theme for the day. But the, so if you just went law of the river, California would be sitting pretty because particularly the Imperial Irrigation District was the earliest water rights claimant on the river. So that's one option. It would have devastating consequences to parts of Arizona, because Arizona has some senior water rights holders, because they voluntarily took junior status in order to get the Central Arizona project built and authorized by Congress. And so, but that could be devastating to parts of Arizona. So the other option that the federal government is looking at as a bookend is just doing even cuts, 13% of whatever your amount is, across the lower basin states of Arizona, Nevada, California, not really touching the upper basin states, but they have control over these reservoirs. So that's what gives them the ability to actually do something a little more quickly than you would in some kind of an adjudication. I won't get into what that means. And so those are the two things they're going to study. You look at the document, they've put out what they think the impacts are across a whole range of things. And then what they will do in August is they will make a unilateral decision and make cuts beyond what the existing law of the river is, or the existing schedule of cuts, and they will justify it. But it will be somewhere, I think, between those two. And as I said earlier today, I think where they're probably going to need to go is somewhere that's not just in the middle there, but which puts a bit of a thumb on the scale for California's water rights, both because they can avoid litigation that way, which delays everything, and which I don't think California really wants. But there are also equities to cutting the big guy, because the big guy's got people and farms and communities that are dependent on all that water too. And so when they review the equities of this in that document, and I haven't read the whole document, I'm sure they will also document the economic harm that would happen to the California water agencies, both the ag and the urban, were those cuts to come. So it's a little wonky, but the thing to realize is that the media has been saying these are the two choices, and because the Deputy Administrator of Interior said they were unlikely to go with something that destroys Arizona, the headlines all ran with they're going to go with this other option that cuts it evenly and kind of gores California. But that is not what he said. I went back. He said these are the bookends we're going to study, and we'll make the decision unless 7 states, you can finally come to a deal. And the key thing to know, just 2 more key things, I'll stop. One is that the rhetoric changed almost immediately. So when the federal government actually put these out and showed they were going to move and said they were going to make a decision, and they could have punked out, but they didn't, thank God. And all of the rhetoric by the water agencies has been more positive, saying, I think we can do this. I think we're having productive conversations now. I think we can get to a deal. Does that mean they will? No. But it was a big change from the end of January. And I haven't found out why that is, but I'm happy that it was. The other thing that's been lost in the media on it is that when last year they were worried about getting to dead pool and losing hydropower, they asked for 25 to 30% cuts, $2 to $4 million, 2 to 4 million acre feet of water. That's a lot of water. That's a lot of football fields covered in a foot of water. This time, the bookends they're studying only go to 2.083 million acre feet. So they've already made a decision that they're not going to go as big, in part because we had this bounty of rain and snow. Could be they chickened out, but I don't think so. Could be they looked at the equities and they thought, let's give it a try. But so the cuts, when they're doing them equally on those 3 states, are 13%. Now, is that still big? Yeah, that's still big. And some areas are more efficient than others, and it's harder to do more, but we can always do more in urban, and we can always do more in ag, but there are consequences. And some of those consequences can be ameliorated by the $4 billion that Congress put into the Inflation Reduction Act to help with this issue through paying farmers to fallow their land. Hopefully there'll be lawn rebates in it. Hopefully there'll be money for the big water recycling projects that are planned here. And a lot of things. And then there's, a $4 billion other dollars in other pockets that's potentially at play. So hopefully in the summer, we'll see either a deal, or we'll see a proposal or a decision from the federal government that tries to get us through what could be a devastating time if we don't act. It will have harsh implications, but nothing compared to the implications if we go back to dry years.
Or we may see the mother of all lawsuits that will last for 10 years, but that's, I think, what people are hoping we'll avoid. Let's see what we have for questions from our audience about anything on the water, climate, or other side of things. And please tell us your name, college, and class year.
Hi, I'm Bailey. I'm a first year at Pitzer. I was wondering what you think about tiered water pricing models for limiting water use in California if Prop 218 is overturned or something.
Well, I think tiered pricing is a really smart idea, and I think you can get around 218 by crossing the T's and dotting the I's. I think what we have, it's a really challenging decision, and there's a split in the Court of Appeals, but it's been hard to get a water agency to try and test it because the cost of litigation is so high. I keep hoping some foundation will indemnify a water agency to do it, and there are water agencies who have done a really good job, budget-based rates, tiered pricing. You just have to document, and I'll explain 218, you just have to document that people are just paying for the service that they're getting. And the way you do that is to do a rate structure where you're showing, and again, take some math and some work, that using the whole, the big water users are actually costing proportionally more. So going after that next new increment of water through desal or water recycling, whatever, costs a lot more money than living within the means of the water we already have. And so the big users actually cost everybody else more. And so you can't, but you have to document it. You can't just assert it. You can do that. And some of the tiered pricing and budget-based rate models that are really good, I think Eastern is particularly good at it, not far from here. You know, there's a basic amount of indoor water use per capita that they calculate. There's a base, they do overflight of what your irrigable acreage is and what a reasonable landscape is, and everybody gets that. And then people who go significantly above it start paying more. I'm saying you know it because you asked the question, but making sure other people know. Our challenge with Prop 218, which energy utilities are exempt, and some things are exempted from it, and unfortunately this wasn't, says that you can't charge people for services they're not getting, and it has caused a crimp in being able to charge. It's made agencies reluctant to charge big users more. Some of them have come up with ways, penalties and other things. It's also, in a really heartbreaking way, made it harder to do angel rates or lifeline rates because overtly subsidizing less well-off community members for water is seen as is not helping them. But you can make an argument that it helps the community. But again, two different courts of appeals have seen it differently. But the San Juan Capistrano case has been enough to scare people away. But I think you can still do it, but it is hard. And changes to Prop 218 to make clear that we don't end up with some of these would actually be helpful. Again, like everything, the proposition came out of abuses, right, where people were charging their customers for things and spending on all kinds of other things. And so the reform ends up creating its own challenge. That was the question. I hope I answered the question you asked. Okay, good.
Hi, my name is Adarsh. I'm a junior studying environment, economics, and politics here at CMC. Thanks so much for the talk. One thing you mentioned that I wanted to ask a little bit more about was CEQA and how the declaration of a drought actually allows the governor to bypass CEQA. So I know especially for the clean energy sort of sector, like CEQA and the NEPA at the federal level have been major impediments towards making any progress, despite the fact that they were, ostensibly passed to protect the environment. I'm curious if in the clean water space, those laws have a similar effect. Like, is there a lot more infrastructure we need to get to a place where we can ensure water security with changing climate conditions? And do we need to find better ways to bypass these laws if we're to make serious progress?
No, thanks for the question. I'm glad you asked it because I I didn't put enough caveat on it. I'm a big believer in CEQA and NEPA, and I've even written about this. I think the big problem is not the laws themselves. I think my experience is the problem is how project proponents approach it. Frequently, I've seen this a lot, and I saw it a lot when I was at Public Works, and we fired all of our CEQA consultants, took it in-house. We wrote shorter documents. We listened to the public. We changed the project based on their good advice. When we were done, we might have had a lawsuit, but we won it, and we had people say thank you, and we had people didn't show up as much, and we had better projects. What I've seen happen is people hand it to consultants as if they're paying them by the word, who give a bunch of boilerplate language, don't answer the question, don't study reasonable alternatives at all. They game it, and then they get sued, and they lose sometimes. Now, are all the lawsuits filed good? No, but a lot of them are. And so I think part of the problem is how project proponents approach CEQA, not CEQA itself. Now, are there lawyers that are litigious and take advantage of it? Sure. Are there people who use it just for delay? Sure. But as a tool, it can make us make much smarter decisions that recognize the real economic impacts, particularly of projects built in the natural world. It's a planning statute. It doesn't make, you can do almost anything you want if you actually do a fair and true document, and I so rarely see a good one. So I want that to be where I sort of stand on this sort of thing. On the other hand, during the drought, that does take time. So there are two different issues. One is what people might think of as abuse of the system, and the other is just doing it takes a lot of time and money that government doesn't always have, and so it can delay things unnecessarily. And if you're in a drought, you have to act fast. And so there are all kinds of things where the water board can't update or change a water right without doing an environmental impact review or a supplemental environmental document, which is an equivalent. That can take a year or two or more. In a drought, you don't have the year or two or more. And so that's part of why you need to waive it, but you need to try not to be stupid about it and abuse it. So I had this conversation with Governor Brown in particular, who famously was very hostile to CEQA after he was the mayor of Oakland, because he saw people using the CEQA process to delay projects, to extract certain agreements and stuff. So he got a very bad taste in his mouth. And we met with a bunch of urban mayors on the drought, and they were talking about CEQA and wanting CEQA waivers or CEQA whatever so they could get recycled water lines down their streets faster. And he turned to me and goes, "You, Enviro girl," he always called me something or other, in a meeting, what do you think about that? Will the environmental community go crazy and hate it as they hate everything reforming CEQA? I said, well, to be fair, I guarantee you if you try and do a very narrow exemption for recycled water lines during the middle of the street, which is what they say they need, I think you'll get fined. But if you start putting a Christmas tree of everything everybody ever wanted, every stadium, every whatever, yeah, they will oppose it. So if you're reasonable, I think you'll be fine. If you abuse it and take advantage of it, you'll get your clock cleaned. So that's...
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Sure. And we can talk about energy if you want sometime afterward, too.
Kyle, you're next, and we only have about 5 more minutes.
Okay, I'll get shorter answers.
Hi, I'm Kyle Greenspan, senior at Pitzer, also majoring in environment, economics, and politics. You mentioned the changing nature of the Sierra snowpack as a reservoir in the state for water, and that the ground's the only place we really have the storage capacity to put it. You also mentioned a policy solution may be relying on those local agencies, the groundwater sustainability agencies of the state's groundwater regulation, as the vehicle to put that water underground. Is that gonna achieve what we need in terms of shifting our storage capacity from the snowpack to the ground, or are there other vehicles that we need to store more water underground beyond those sustainability agencies?
A good question. I mean, there's also direct aquifer injection, which happens in some places, but you've got to make sure the water is clean enough, because when you let it percolate, as you know, it cleans it up. Magic touch of nature actually works in a lot of cases. And you also got to make sure you're not moving a plume if you're in a place where there's a plume. The state is actually doing a lot to try and help that as well. Part of it is the land repurposing money to help find the right places to buy out. It does other things to allow farmers who are going to go out can see the handwriting on the wall, transfer to solar or lower water use, crops, or other uses. So efficiency is first and foremost what we need to do. But they're also trying to help make that happen through grants, planning grants, and other grants. But they're also spending the money to do the flyovers of the whole Central Valley and the tractors through the farms to map the underground so that we're more efficient and effective with putting it in the right places, because some places it won't sink in, like look at Tulare Lake, which is underlain with the Corcoran clay. That's why Corcoran is called Corcoran, or why the clay there is called the Corcoran clay, because Corcoran's there, whichever way you want to look at it. But there are some places where it just is going to go in faster, and then you also have to figure out where you can take it out, because it's not like a well, right? So it really varies. So the state is spending millions of dollars right now to overfly and look for those perfect places to help the local agencies find the right places. I think the state is also looking in the Central Valley Flood Plan to try and encourage the kind of floodplain setbacks I was talking about, because that will also yield more groundwater recharge. So it's a mix of what the sustainability agencies are doing and what the state is doing to enable it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Riley. I go to Pitzer College. I'm a senior. I'm over in the biology department. And I guess I'm curious about kind of connections, given your experience, between sort of cities, municipalities, regional governments, state governments, academics. It seems like the connections between those things is a common thread in implementing solutions. And I'm curious, in your experience at these different levels, like, what are some of the connections that you feel are working really well right now? Where are points where connections are not happening enough? And what are some ways to sort of help strengthen those connections to make these implementations more efficient?
That's a good and a really big question, because it's a mix, right? So there are some water agencies that are really good and adept at taking advantage of state programs for integrated regional water management. They're good at putting together plans. They're good at putting together unlikely allies for really interesting projects, and they're far-sighted in diversifying their water supplies and then going after funding for all of them and influencing rules and regulations. So you have some urban agencies very supportive of statewide water efficiency legislation that passed and regulations that are in the process of being adopted, because they know that efficiency is the cheapest, fastest, smartest thing, and they want everybody to be doing it, and they want support for it. You have other agencies who just want to be left alone and just send me a check every now and then for whatever I want to build. That's not going as well. You've got, and this is a mix, you've got the Human Right to Water statute having been passed in 2012, first one in the country. It's passed and signed. It had been passed before but not signed. And you've got billions that have gone into the capital improvements that are going to be needed in mid-sized to small communities. You've got a funding source that Governor Newsom got to help even subsidize operation and maintenance. The first time I know of for small communities for whom you could build facilities, but they can't even afford the person to run them or the chemicals to keep it going. And you've got progress there, and you've got, I think the latest set of numbers, the state board estimated they had 1.6 million people that didn't have access to clean, safe water. Some didn't have access to water. More had access to contaminated water. It's now down by a considerable amount, to closer to 1. And they upped that number. We were at 1, but they made the number bigger, which is, governments don't normally do that. I thought that was good. They just, more data, more refinement. So they're in process, but it's not perfect yet. And there's still a lot of people in California. So I would say that's going well, because we're in motion more than any other state to deal with it. It's not going, I can't just say it's going well, because we still have so many people who don't have an adequate water supply system that can treat it at the level that our high level of treatment requires. There are pockets of real light in the floodplain setbacks. I think the thing I'm most excited about is water recycling finally taking off. I like to think we helped with that by doing some statewide regulations that people would know what to expect for groundwater recharge, for aquifer injection, for agricultural uses, for reservoir augmentation, and by the end of this year, the state board will finish direct potable reuse, and that has unleashed projects all over the state. And we put out $1.5 billion in grants and loans when I was there, more since, but not at that level. Where I'm now going to ribbon cuttings of things that happen, and where you have Metropolitan going for what will be the next, the biggest water recycling project in the world, to be eclipsed by the city of LA's, which will be the biggest in the world, and last Friday being at a ribbon cutting for Orange County's now biggest in the world, 130 MGD. That is incredible. The City of LA project will yield a third of the water supply for the city, which is amazing and exciting, and I think there's a lot of support for that at the state level, although they need to add a few $1 billion to get us over the transom. So it's kind of a mix. I mean, I'm giving you a hodgepodge, but it is kind of a hodgepodge.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. We're
May-
terrible on fish, though, I will say. Between fish and water users, we're doing a terrible job.
Well, maybe hodgepodge isn't a bad term for people to think about, because if anything, Felicia, you've illustrated to us tonight how immensely complicated water issues are. I'm reminded of Mark Twain's famous remark that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting in California. But thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. I know you have to catch an airplane tonight to head back home, but you may be a little bit of room. I don't know if Mina's here with us for one or two questions privately up here beforehand, but we have to check the schedule and see. But please, everyone, give Felicia a hand as thanks for being with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.